Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time we have a question from Kale Iahuli, probably saying that wrong, my apologies, but they asked, "Hey Thor, I've been watching Star Wars since the beginning and seen the portrayal of the Force evolve dramatically over the different eras. It began as a spiritual part of nature in the OT and moved to biological science in the prequels. It feels like modern Star Wars has turned it into a kind of magic that suits whatever writers need it to do. How do you feel the Force fits into the current franchise, and do you have any thoughts on changing it any further?" And I think this is a rather tricky question, because on the one hand, I do agree that many who create Star Wars today do sort of treat it or use it as magic. They maybe don't understand the deeper meanings of the Force, or don't care to understand them, and it is just something that allows them to do whatever they want or need it to do in order to tell the story they want to tell, or to have a cool or epic moment in their story, and they do it without thinking about what it'll mean for the bigger picture of Star Wars or the Force on the whole and how it all works. One example would be Rey in The Last Jedi sort of easily lifting who knows how many tons of boulders and barely breaking a sweat in the process. Even though like 3 days before this in story, and I mean literally like 3 days, she wasn't even sure that Luke Skywalker was anything but a myth. She wasn't even sure that the Force was a real thing. And when Luke asked her during her training, which is actually more like Luke trying to convince her not to be a Jedi, but when he asks her what the Force even is, she says it was a power that lets you lift rocks, or whatever exactly she said. Basically, she had zero understanding or clue of what it was, what the Force was, or how to use it pretty much the day before she did this with the rocks. And so the problem with this is that a sort of bedrock idea of Star Wars, I'd argue, that those who seek to use the light side of the Force, or who seek to become a Jedi, that it will require of them a lot of hard work and discipline, a lot of training, which also equates to a real life lesson Star Wars tries to convey, that to get the things we want here in the real world, we must have patience and be willing to put in the hard work. That we have to resist the urge to take the quick and easy path, to take shortcuts, or to cheat our way to success. But that idea that virtually everyone will need to have a good degree of training to use the Force efficiently, especially again to use the light side of the Force, that is the more disciplined side, and to use it in order to do some pretty incredible feats, I'd argue, like lifting multiple tons of boulders, or that we'd have to overcome perhaps our own mental hurdles along the way, like overcoming the mental block of size mattering not, which Luke had to in The Empire Strikes Back, and apparently Rey had no issue with that. Anyway, all that essentially gets tossed out the window. A bedrock idea of Star Wars gets tossed out the window because Rian Johnson thought that it all made for a beautiful shot and gave Rey her hero moment for the movie. And any consideration for what it meant for, well, everything else we knew about the Force and Star Wars and how it all works wasn't a thought in his mind. And the thing is, every time you do something with the Force, anything at all really, no matter how big or small it may be, it becomes yet another piece of the lore surrounding the Force and a part of the bigger mystery that is the Force, which becomes less and less a mystery the more you get of it, the more we see and learn about it because of how much material or content is now out there. And yeah, how it's being treated or used today by creators also plays a big part. They are kind of accelerating the process of what the Force is, or how it could be used. Yet, I would also argue that over time, in some capacity at least, the Force does need to expand, or we do need to learn more about it, which leads back to why I said this is a sort of tricky question at the start. Because, yeah, you do have to do some new and different things with it from time to time. You do have to, through the story, tell us a little bit more about it. I mean, imagine if all we still knew about the Force, decades later, was the little bits Obi-Wan and Yoda told Luke in the original trilogy. We'd probably find that a bit frustrating to not have learned anything else. But I think the key is, when it comes to something like the Force, where part of the fun, I would say, or what makes it kind of unique and interesting, is that much of it is unknown, that it is very mysterious, and probably can't or maybe shouldn't even be known. But with something like the Force, I think you want to try and grow the lore around it more laterally, if you will. You want to give us small pieces that enhance what we already know, or only pull the curtain back just a little bit. Not so much change things about it or what we already knew or thought we knew. And you certainly don't want to make it feel like the Force is somehow getting more and more powerful as we get more stories, or that characters, for some reason, have abilities to use it that go way, way beyond what we've seen before, or just pick it up and learn it quicker than the previous characters did. Unless, I guess, you try to give it a very, very good in-story reason, which is what I initially thought The Force Awakens was potentially going to do, though I don't know that the reason behind it was going to be good. But I thought after, say, the success of the Avengers film, or of the MCU on the whole at this time, after how huge superheroes had become in the early to mid-20-teens, I guess you could call them, I was afraid that Star Wars was going to lean into that. Say there was an awakening of the Force, which meant more power, and that the Jedi were going to become something akin to superheroes with superpowers. And I'm not sure my fears were entirely unwarranted there. Either way, as I was trying to point out with Rey and the boulders, if you're not careful with what you do with the Force, it can and will potentially, shall we say, contradict what we previously knew and make things not make a whole lot of sense when you step back and look at the bigger picture. And there is a big difference between contradicting what we knew and expanding or elaborating on what we knew, which again I think is fine and needs to be done in some way, shape, or form. For example, and I know some people hate midichlorians, which I get, but learning about them didn't technically contradict what we knew before or change the power of the Force. Yes, as the question pointed out, it did kind of turn the Force from purely a spiritual thing into something a little more scientific. And I suppose you could argue that in itself is very contradicting. I could see that argument being made and kind of agree with it. Especially when you consider that it seems to quantify force power. It seems to put a number on force potential, and that is quite the change, yes. But other than that, the Force wasn't different in the prequels in terms of how it was used or what was done with it. We weren't suddenly seeing crazy force powers or anything like that, even with the Jedi at the height of their power. And given the technology Lucas had access to over what he did when he made the original trilogy, he certainly could have had Jedi doing all sorts of crazy things with the Force, or the Sith, of course. But really, nothing in the prequels doesn't line up with what we see in the original trilogy, or contradict anything in it when it comes to the power of the Force. Not even the prophecy of the Chosen One, as much as some don't like that either. Not even that contradicts what we knew from before. In fact, other than, again, learning about midichlorians, you can argue, the Force in the prequels, what's done with it, the Force powers we see, they're either the exact same ones, most of them are, or they're right on par with the ones used in the original trilogy, like seeing Force Jump or Force Sprint, for example. And though, as I said, I know some people hate midichlorians, and I can understand why, and a part of me is not the hugest fan of them either, but another part of me just likes to know what Lucas envisions the Force to be. I like knowing how it all works, and I don't blame Lucas for wanting to share his ideas in his story. I think he was really trying to make a point about symbiotic relationships and how everything, whether you realize it or not, is connected and dependent on others, and about things working as they should in harmony, things being in balance with one another. Clearly, that is a theme embedded in the prequels, and Lucas thought midichlorians were a way to help explore it. As for, or quickly getting back to how it's been explored since the prequels, or how it's used today, and mind you, I didn't even talk about anything Legends did with the Force, that would be a video in itself. But as for the things that are in the official current canon, things like Mortis and the Mortis gods that Clone Wars introduced, and while Lucas was still very much in charge, mind you, as well as the Force priestess that Yoda encounters, and then you move on to stuff like the World Between Worlds, which Filoni has added, or the Bendu. And though, again, a part of me understands needing to expand the Force, and I love to talk about this and discuss the Force and how it all works and the different intricate parts of it and what else is involved with it, I do wonder if some of these concepts have just gone too far and would feel way, way out of place if, say, they were in the original trilogy. If Yoda, during The Empire Strikes Back, was sitting there telling Luke about the midichlorians in his blood, and how there's this place called the World Between Worlds, and that once upon a time he met a Force priestess and all that sort of thing. I don't know how warmly that would have been welcomed all those years ago during that film. People would have thought it's all crazy. But honestly, I think that sort of stuff, shall we say, kind of bugs me less than how the Force is sometimes used, or seeing it used in ways that, again, greatly contradict or call into question previous parts of the story. In other words, I think I'm okay with certain things around the Force expanding. I just never want to see it become something everyday average Force users like the Jedi and Sith, who I guess are anything but average, but you get my point. I don't want to see them using insane Force powers and making Star Wars feel like some kind of generic magic system, or like they're just another name for superheroes now. The Force is what makes Star Wars unique, and yes, like I've been saying, you have to expand it in order to give people kind of more to chew on when it comes to that, so that it stays kind of fresh and keeps progressing, you could say. But at the same time, the more you give, the less mysterious and curious it becomes, the more convoluted it potentially becomes, and eventually it kind of loses its luster. It loses everything that makes it interesting in the first place. It is kind of strange how, when it comes to something like Star Wars or the Force, less is very much more. You want to know everything about the Force, but the more you learn, again, the less interesting it becomes. And this is something I really feel they must avoid, but aren't doing such a great job of when they keep throwing new and new, kind of strange lore at us. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about all this. What do you think about what the Force has, shall we say, become over the years, from purely natural part of the world to more scientific to what it is today? Or you can always ask a question for a future lightning response video. All you got to do is start your comment off with "Hey Thor" and then ask away. But whatever you do, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.